Well, now that we've built our house, we need to do some gardening. So today we're going to start with the grassy hill that the house sits upon. And this will give me the opportunity to teach you how to use the Victorian style cross stitch. So as usual, we'll start by looking at our chart. And we need to look at 2 pages. We need to look at pages 5 and 6. The grassy area is really made up of 4 different colors. We're going to start with the O symbol here, and we're actually going to be working the stitch from right to left. So we're going to begin right here. So the important thing to notice here is that we are 1, 2, 3 stitches beyond the edge of the house. Now there are more stitches this way, but we're going to do those after we get the other part done. Please note that, like most designers, I try to choose the symbols that are the least confusing and are as different from each other as possible. There are 2 symbols here where I can see where the uninitiated could get confused. We have a symbol here that looks like a capital O or the number 0. And we also have more of a donut shaped O. So notice that this is the one that matches the symbol on our chart now. So that's your light olive green, whether you're working with Cosmo or DMC, that's the color that we want to thread up right now. I've shared before how I like using thread drops to organize my threads, and one of the reasons I like them so much is that when you want to stitch with a single strand, how easy it is to pull one strand out, and then this just straightens right back out again. And of course, I'm going to prep my thread by dampening it with a sponge that's just dampened with water, and I keep it in a little container that's actually made for holding individual servings of salad dressing. I'll show you the lid. It comes with this lid, so it's very, very tight and doesn't leak in my bag. And I just cut a couple sponges to fit in there, and I just keep them wet. I do need to clean them every once in a while. If you leave them in the container for a long period of time, they will get kind of funky. Now the reason I dampen the floss is simply to straighten it out, and by doing that I have the least chance of knots and tangles in my work. And I have found over the years it's the most effective prevention of knots and tangles. So I'm going to start with a loop method here. So I'm going to thread the 2 cut ends into the eye of my tapestry needle. And I am using a number 26 tapestry needle. And I'm stuck. Oh, there it goes. And the brand that I use is John James, and I like them for a lot of reasons. And I think that all those reasons have to do with the fact that it's still manufactured in the same way it has been for hundreds of years in the UK. So, okay. So again, this next row that we're going to be doing juts out by 3 stitches on the right hand side of the house. And bear with me, I need to adjust my camera a little bit here. My challenge is, as a teacher and a stitcher, is setting this up so that you can see it easily and that I'm comfortable stitching. And sometimes those 2 things are at cross purposes. So I'm going to have 3 stitches beyond this corner of the house, but I want to just come over 2 squares on Aida or 4 threads on your linen. So there's 2, 3, 4, and come down 2 threads. Or again, if you are on Aida, you're going to come down 1 square. And we're going to do a traditional half cross. And I'm going to secure this on the back by taking my needle through the loop and bringing it down so that that loop is very much flush against my fabric. And back around to the right side. And this is where my next needle motion here is what makes this different from the Danish style of cross stitch. For the Victorian cross, I'm going to cross the stitch by going from here to here. So my first stitch is going bottom left to upper right, and my second leg is upper left to bottom right. Now the next stitch is going to begin right here. Before I proceed, I want to make sure that I don't have any twists in my stitching thread. So I'm going to bring my needle between the 2 threads, the full length of the strand, all the way up to the needle. And as I do, I want to put my finger in between here for a second. As I do, what you'll see is I'm basically pushing the twists up to the needle. And I can either just untwist it like this, or I can pull the needle back through that. But my objective here is to, if I start with my 2 strands being parallel to each other, then I stand a better chance of them being parallel as I'm stitching. Now, what I'm going to show you is what makes the Victorian cross one of my favorite stitches when I'm doing a linear design element like this. I can scoop up 2 linen threads here, or again, if I'm on Aida, I'm scooping up 1 square. And then I come down here, and I'm actually going under that stitch that I just executed and going ahead by 2 threads. Let's see if I can come in closer here and so you can get a better idea. So I'm scooping under 2 threads. And then down here, I'm actually scooping up 4 threads. Again, on Aida, that would be 2 squares. And you can see where this is a nice smooth motion, and it goes very quickly. And as you're stitching, you're doing a complete cross stitch. And so it makes it ideal for doing a single row of stitches. Now I remembered that this green, this O symbol, was all along the base of the house, but I couldn't remember how many stitches beyond the house it went. So I'm glad I stopped when I did, because I only have 1 more stitch to do. Then I'm going to drop down and do 2 stitches, and drop down and do 2 more. And what I mentally tell myself is I've got 1 more stitch to do, and then 2 pair, and then this row, remember your dark lines indicate 10 stitches. So there's 10, 11, 12, 13. So I'm going to do 1, and then 2 pair, and then 13. So there's my 1 more. And now I'm going to finish that stitch and bring my needle not just ahead 2 threads, but also down 2 threads. Now this is a good time to talk to you about how to keep your place. And I'm really hoping I can come in here close enough for you to see that to the right of my needle, the linen weave, the top part of that intersection is what we call a vertical thread. And that helps me keep my place. When you get enough practice under your belt, you'll start seeing that vertical thread just automatically. So I did my single stitch, and now I'm doing my double stitch, and I can see that my thread's gotten kind of twisted, so I'm twirling my needle to undo that. So there's the second in that pair, and I'm coming down one, two, and about this time, every stitcher asks themselves, am I going to have enough thread to finish this row? And we'll see, won't we? So I did my 1, my 2 pair, and now I'm going to do 13. Well, I think I made it with just enough thread. Let's take a look at the back. So one of the things I want to point out to you is how different the stitches look on the back. When you do a Victorian cross rather than the Danish cross, you end up with these parallel lines on the back. And this is why I am, on my list of things I'm bothered by are people who think that the only way the back of your cross stitch is proper is if your stitches are straight up and down on the vertical. And, I'm here to tell you that is just not true. So, how do you anchor your thread, though, when you have these parallel lines? And this, again, is where I use that serpentine crawl idea. I'm going to slip my needle under the stitch and then turn around and come back in the other direction. And then go back in this direction. And I do this 4 or 5 times, so that's 3. Oops, sorry, I'm off camera. 4 and 5. And you can see I really came close, didn't I? And again, I started with a 30-inch length, folded in half to make my loop start, and that's how much I had left. And again, I just cannot stress enough to cut your thread off very close. There's just no need to leave like another half of an inch. If you don't feel like it's secure, then secure it under more stitches. Don't try to buy security by adding by leaving a tail. Now what we'll do is we'll thread the needle with another length of the same color and do this side of the hill. So on this side of the house, we have 2 pair, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 stitches to do. I still want to be working from right to left. Now, I have to confess here that I am what I call, affectionately, a lazy stitcher. I see no reason to count over and down to find this spot so that I can stitch back in this direction when I can achieve the same stitch a whole lot easier if I turn my chart upside down and turn my work upside down. I can still work right to left and do my 2 stitches, my other 2 stitches, and then do this row. The important thing is orient your chart in the same way that your fabric lies. Also, with cross stitch, you are safe to turn your fabric in your chart 180 degrees. When you do, your crosses will all have the same half cross on the top, will always lie in the same direction, whether you're right side up or upside down. So I've now turned my work upside down, and I'm going to start with my loop method again. So I'll put in my half cross. And now the same thing. I've done my half cross. So now I'm going to slip on the bottom of my stitching row. I'm slipping my needle under 4 threads. When I eat it, that would be 2 squares. Scooping under 2 threads here. Again, on I eat it, that would be 1 square. And now I need to go on the diagonal, so I'm finishing this stitch and putting my needle where the next pair is going to begin. Finishing that pair, bringing my needle out, and again, a clue that I'm in the right place is I have a vertical thread to the right of my needle. And now I've got the straightaway to do. One of the dangers with Victorian cross is that you get into this rhythm, and if you're not paying attention to where you're supposed to stop, you can find yourself stitching off the edge of the fabric. So one of the things you can do, if you have some of those pretty marking pins, or I should say counting pins, you could always put a pin or something where you're supposed to stop. I just stopped to check, and I only have 2 more stitches to do, so I'm glad I was aware of that. So before I anchor my thread, I will count again and make sure that this is right. So 15 was our magic number. So okay, so I have 15. Going to anchor this by slipping my working thread under weaving it about 5 times. I didn't do this on the other side, but here's another little tip. And that is to end by leaving the tail between these two rows. So by slipping it on under just half the stitch and cutting this off, then that extra little tail is lying between these two rows. And this is especially important with dark colors when you're stitching on a light colored fabric like I am, because you don't want these trailing threads to be showing through on the back. So that's the Victorian cross, and that's defining the area of our grass. So now we have another color of green that gets filled in underneath here. So the other green has this dark circle symbol, and let's see where this is placed. Now, it's going to end up with a straight row across here. And notice that it's one stitch shy of the row we just did. So if we start stitching here, and I'm not saying we're going to, but if I started stitching here, I could stitch straight across and then fill in up this area. Let's look on the other side. Same thing. When I get over here, I'll stop one stitch shy of there. Now, what I'm going to suggest that we do is go back to the Danish method, and we're going to start up here and do a half cross over and a half cross back. And so for the first 1, 2, 3 rows, we're just going to be filling in the area that we just defined. Once we get those 3 rows done, then we will pop up over here and be one stitch shy of our first row to make our last row. So then here's my next color, and this will give me the opportunity to give you another couple of hints about thread drops. One is that when I am not using the colors, I put them in these loose knots. When I have very similar colors, like these 2 olive greens, the one that I'm working with, I set that aside, and I take the other ones that I'm not using, and again, like I said, I just put them in a very loose knot, like this. And that not only helps me to avoid picking up the wrong color, but it also keeps my other threads from getting knotted. And here, for example, is the gold that I used for the house, and I didn't put it back into this hank, so I'm going to do that right now. And there's no necessarily rhyme or reason of which colors I have together, but I find it keeps them in better shape if I make these loose knots like this. Okay, so here's the color that we're using next. So while I have this out, I'm going to go ahead and find my needle and pull out a strand. The other hint that I will give you is when I stitch with this is just a navy blue dinner napkin that I put in my lap, and it helps me to see more clearly. I can see especially when I put on my put on this close-up camera, then I can just see so much more clearly than if there's, say, white behind here. There's not much new to tell you in this section. I've started with the loop method again, and I'm using the Danish method going across with a half cross, and then when I get to the end of this section, I'll come back with the other half cross to make my full cross stitch. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm not using the Victorian cross, let me tell you about that. I have experimented with them, and maybe it's just my tension, I don't know. But when I do a solid area with multiple rows of Victorian cross, I can kind of see the rows. They just seem to stand out to me, and I don't see kind of a unified space. You may try it and find that you can fill in an area with Victorian cross, and it may look just fine. So you may want to experiment and see if that works for you. I love the Victorian cross. I would use it all the time if I felt that my stitches were just as pretty using the Victorian cross instead of the Danish method. So I'm going to be stitching all the way over to here and back, and then same thing with the next row and the next. So I've got 3 rows to do like that before I come back with any more commentary or tips or whatever. This is my second strand of this color to fill this space. And as you see, I just have a couple more stitches to finish crossing here. Now I don't have very much thread left in my needle, so I'm going to end my thread here with this last stitch. Even if I had a good length in my needle, I'm not sure I would go from here all the way back over to here. By the time I tunnel under to get over there, I might as well as end the thread where I'm finished right here and start a new thread right here. So now what I have to do is a really long row from here to here. And remember, looking at the chart, I'm going to come in 1 stitch on this side and stop 1 stitch before I get to the end of the lighter green row. So I'm starting that next row with a loop method, and again this row will be 1 stitch short of the row above it on both ends. So I filled in the hill and did my straight row across here, remembering that I'm 1 stitch in on the left and 1 stitch in on the right. And so the next thing is that checkerboard pattern beneath the hill. And on your chart, you see that that involves 2 colors, the X symbol and kind of the double dot. Now, the tendency would be to start over here on the left, but I'm actually going to start us right here because I want to do these complete blocks. And my purpose in this next segment is to broaden your horizons, to think beyond working in rows. Sometimes working on the diagonal makes the most sense. So I'm actually going to do this set of 9 stitches. That's 3 across and 3 rows. And then I'm going to move on to this one and move on to this one. And I'm starting there simply because I have complete blocks. And then next to it is the lighter color, and I'll do the same thing. And then I'll start working on the where I've got partial blocks. I've got a whole block here, a whole block here, and then a partial one here. So that's going to be my my strategy for this next part. I'm going to work these rows of 3 stitches in the Danish method left to right. So this will be my first stitch. and it lines up directly with the left-hand side of this window. So let's find that spot on my fabric. I've threaded my needle with the medium khaki. This is the window that I want to line up along. So directly beneath that window right here is my first stitch, which again, I'm using the loop method for starting this strand. Before I go any further, I'm going to double check my placement. So of these two windows, it's this window I'm lined up against, and I'm directly underneath that. So I'm going to go ahead and get this set of 9 stitches done, and then I'm going to rejoin you. So this finishes up my first block of, that's 3 stitches by 3 stitches. Now my next box is going to be 3 stitches to the left here. So there's 1, 2, 3. Now if you're on Aida, that's 3 squares. On linen or even weave, 6 threads. But now I need to go down 2 more threads. And again, you can see that I'm starting by that vertical thread here. As I'm taking these first couple of stitches, I'm going to angle my needle slightly like this so I can catch my traveling thread in the back. And now I'll do this next box of 9 and then do the same thing to do the third box. This is where I'm going to begin my other color, and although my stitches over here will start in a filled hole and go into a filled hole, after that I'll be starting in empty holes and going into filled holes. And so that's kind of the principle that I want to employ here. And I believe it's one of the things that makes for pretty stitches. You can't always do that, it's true. But as much as possible, start in an unfilled hole and stitch into a filled hole. Empty hole into a filled hole. So I'll be stitching a box here and here and here of the lighter color. And just to confirm that, let's take a look at the chart. The first of the boxes of the light colors is right here. And I just want to confirm by looking at page 6 that it is indeed a complete box, and it is. So I'm going to have 3 complete boxes of that lighter color. I've anchored my first half cross with the loop method. And now I'm ready to stitch the 3 stitches that make up the first row of the lighter colored box. So that's my first lighter color square done. And now again, I'm going to come over here on the diagonal and start the next square. I'm poking the first couple of stitches just to make sure that I'm catching my traveling thread on the back. I've completed these 3 blocks of color, and now the next 3 that I want to do are right here. But the first thing I need to check is to see whether or not this bottom block is going to be the complete 9 stitches or if it's just going to be a partial one. I can't remember, so let's take a look at the chart. If in doubt, always look. So this is the first set I did, and then I did this set. So this is the bottom one that I'm talking about. And I'm glad I looked, because when the bottom row is only going to be 1 stitch, and it's going to be the one on the far right. And then I'll have 3 stitches above it and 3 stitches above that, and then complete blocks here. And the reason that's important is I'm going to work this series from bottom to top. I finished up over here, so that's the closest point for my next stitch. But it's also going to allow me to start the greatest majority of stitches in an empty hole and go into a filled hole. So once again, I recommend that you turn your chart upside down, so it's going to be oriented the same way as your fabric. So next to this completed block of the darker khaki, I'm going to have 1 stitch, and then the next row 3, the next row 3, and then these will be complete blocks. So I'm going to turn my fabric upside down. And this is where I'm going to begin. Now, although that's a fairly short distance, I'm going to take the time to slip my working thread under one of those stitches. I'm doing that out of an abundance of caution. So here's where I have the single stitch. And that's all I'll have on this row. Now I want to make sure that where I parked my thread is not being caught. And it's not, so I'm good there. Coming over in this direction to start the first stitch in the next block of color. And once again, I'm going to angle my needle slightly to catch that traveling thread on the back. Now I'm running out of thread, so I'm going to go ahead and secure this tail and start a new strand. When I don't feel like I have enough stitches to go under in one direction, I make a U-turn and go back in the other direction. Now this tail is the thread that I parked earlier. And actually I reparked it because originally I carried it over in this direction and I felt like it might get in the way of these stitches, so I reparked it over in this direction. So now I'm going to rethread my needle with a new strand and do these 3 stitches and then complete this block of color, and then I'm going to park that strand off in this direction until I'm ready for it for the next series. So I finished that last block of color, and now I'm going to bring my working thread over here Just make some big looping stitches to park it out of the way. I have quite a length here, so it's a big parking space. Now I'm going to turn this around. And undo this part thread, rethread this needle, and start the next series of stitches. I'm holding my chart upside down so it's oriented in the same direction in which I'm going to be stitching. Now this is my target block. That's where I'm going to be stitching next. The last time I used this color was over here, and I had parked my excess thread. So I'm going to be carrying that thread behind these stitches to be able to start here. And I'm going to just slip it under a couple of work stitches on the back. And this will anchor where I'm carrying that thread, which will keep it from sagging and also prevent me from accidentally snagging it with other stitches. So I'll complete the row of 3 stitches across here and work this entire area. So I'm going to go back and forth in the same fashion to fill in this half of the area. After finishing the left side, I then went to work on the right-hand side, working from the stitches that I had completed over towards the right. My next task is going to be to start the blue circle border. But before I do that, I want to kind of proofread and make sure that my stitch count along here is exactly right. If there are any errors, then my blue circle will be off, and then the flower border beyond that will be off. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. Well, I'm glad that I did that because I found that I missed this stitch and these 2 stitches. So I'm going to add those, and then I'll be right back with starting the blue circle. A couple footnotes about the checkerboard area before I proceed. One is that in retrospect, I kind of wish that I had used a highlighter and highlighted in yellow the squares I was getting ready to do, and then going back over them in pink when I had finished them. And I think that if I had done that, I probably wouldn't have missed these little stitches that I just had to add, which, you know, was no big deal. But I think that that would have kept me on track a little bit better. You remember that I started with one of the groups of 3 that was a complete pattern and worked over to the left and then back over to the right. That's one way of tackling this. I could have also started with this little group of 3 and then gone on to this group and this group and this group and just worked over either from right to left or left to right. So keep in mind that many of the tips that I'm giving you, it's one of many ways of approaching this. I think that the things to remember from this is that sometimes working on the diagonal is what makes sense more than working in rows across. That whenever possible, start in an empty hole and work toward a filled hole. And that sometimes working from top to bottom makes sense, and sometimes working from bottom to top makes sense. So I think that if you come away with those 3 principles in mind, then there are many, many different ways that you can tackle this area that will be just fine. Now it's time for me to talk about the border. Not just in this project, but in any sampler I've ever done, I have never been an advocate of doing the complete border before doing the interior part of the sampler. I know that that is very much opposite what many stitchers do. Many feel like they want to quote unquote get the border out of the way, or they feel like that by doing the border first that they are assured of not making any mistakes on the interior. And I guess I just am not an advocate of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my blue circle right here next to the grass that we already have done and work around counterclockwise. And I'm going to be using, as much as possible, basically using the Victorian cross stitch as I work my way around. I'm not going to start the flowers and vine right now. My objective is going to be to get this blue circle done. And on the other side of the sampler, I'm going to put in this tree. And I feel like that if I get that much done this week, that will keep me on target. Since I've double checked my stitching of the checkerboard area, I don't even need to look at my chart for this part of the blue circle border because it's simply 1 stitch wide and it's right up against the grass area. I'm starting over on this side with the loop method so that when I get to the parts where there are a string of stitches in a row, I'll be able to use the Victorian method. I've also prepped my thread to make sure that my 2 strands are parallel to each other. So although this part's only 2 stitches right here, I'm going to go ahead and use Victorian to go across the 2. Several of you have already also asked about how I manage my fabric when I'm stitching in hand. And you can see that I've rolled up the excess fabric and I'm just keeping it between my 2 of my fingers. And that's basically all I do. And then I'll just unroll it as I progress. I'm coming close to the end of my strand here. I think maybe 1 more stitch. Now, even though this is the navy strand that I've been stitching with, I don't have to just bury it in this area. I can actually come up here and bury it under the green stitches. I would just say that in general, try not to bury 2 threads in the exact same spot. Sometimes, again, that's unavoidable, but whenever possible, try to keep the back flat by not overdoing it with building up a lot of threads on the back. Now I'll start my next strand and pick up and keep on around here. Now when I get to this side, I'm not going to necessarily stop right when I get to the green. If I still have more thread in my needle, and I think I will, then I'll just keep building up this way. I want to add some more comments to my statement about not doing a complete sampler border before doing the interior. One of the reasons that I don't do that is that even if when you get around to the other side, whether it's a circle like this or a square or a rectangle, just because the 2 parts meet doesn't mean that you don't have a mistake. You could have 2 offsetting errors that would result in meeting at the corner or a circle meeting, and you won't find the mistake until you're well into the sampler. So I prefer to work the sampler border that is close to the interior part of the sampler, so that each part is basically confirming that the other part is correct. I hope that that makes sense. Basically, counted cross stitch is a series of correlations. You are stitching each thing as it relates to the things around it. So you're constantly placing objects, whether they're letters or other motifs or features or whatever, you're placing them as they relate to other things that are already stitched. Now, you know what my philosophy is. If stitching a complete border is the way you like to tackle a project, then that's fine. There's nothing that says that you can't do that. I am making this series with the beginner in mind, and I don't think it's doing a beginner any good service to make them think that stitching the complete border is where you need to start each time. I've come around to my last stitch where I can get away without looking at my chart, and from this point on I am going to have to read the chart. And I'm also going to have to shift the way I'm stitching a little bit, because I'm no longer really stitching right to left. I'm going to be stitching upward. So I can do one of two things. I can turn my chart and my stitching upside down, or I can alter the way I make the stitches. And what I'm about to share with you is how I approach this. And again, there are many, many different ways. Once I've done this stitch, that's right next to the grass, from there on out, I have to pay attention to my chart. So in my mind, I refer to these stitches as singles. So not counting this one, which I know where it's going to be based on the grass line. I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 singles. Then I'm going to have a double, a double, a double, a double. So I tell myself, so I'm not constantly looking at my chart, to stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 singles, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doubles. And that's about all my brain can handle. And frankly, I'm not even sure my thread's going to last that long. So here's my last stitch along the grass. And I'm going to start this one stitching in a little bit different method. So notice that I did my first half cross like we do traditionally, and this one is somewhat like we would do a Victorian, except from here I'm going to start coming up a stitch. So I'm 2 threads above where the stitch ended. So there's my first cross, my first half, followed by my second half cross to make a complete stitch. So again, this is why I am bothered by people who think cross stitches have to be done in one method. So here I'm making my first half upper right to lower left, and my second one from upper left to lower right. And it appears just like all the other ones. So on the topic of best practices, one of the things you do want to do is to make sure that your top crosses, the top part of your cross stitch, are all lying in the same direction. It doesn't really matter how you form it. Again, if you're stitching on Aida, you'll be doing this over one square rather than 2 threads crossing 2 threads. And I better stop and count. So not counting my stitch next to my grass, I have 1, 2, whoops, I have a mistake right there, and I'm going to go back and fix that right now. So this is stitch number 7 with the singles, and now it's time for me to start doing my doubles. I think one more pair and I am going to end this thread. I think that's nice and secure now. And as always, I'm going to cut this off very, very close to the end of the thread. The next area I'm going to stitch is the tree with the red berries on the end. So I'm going to stitch this from bottom up, again, so that I'm doing the least amount of counting and having the best chance of doing it without making a counting error. So on the straightaway part, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th stitch in from the hill is where I'm going to begin. So counting from here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. This is my 5th stitch in on this part of the grassy area. And I'm going to do my half cross and secure it with a loop on the back. Now, since I want to stitch from bottom up, I'm going to turn my work 180 degrees. Now let's talk about strategy. There are many different ways that you could go about stitching this tree. And again, since I'm stitching from the bottom up, I'm turning my chart upside down. Do I want to start with the trunk of the tree and stitch from here up and then go back and do the branches? Or am I going to do the branches as I'm going along with my stitching? And there's no single right way to do this. My inclination is to stitch my trunk first and then start tackling the branches. So how many stitches is that? Well, we have 10 right here between these dark lines. So plus 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 stitches altogether. I can think of it that way, or if I come across this way, once I get to the roof area, I'm 3 stitches beyond this part of the roof is directly across from here. So I have 2 ways of making sure that I've got the right number of stitches in the trunk. I want to make sure that my threads are parallel to each other before I start stitching. I'm going to stitch a single row of 19 stitches. I stopped and counted. I have 16 so far, so 3 more. Three stitches beyond the edge of the roof. Now I can turn my work back around right side up. So how do I go about adding the branches now? I'm going to leave 2 stitches here, and then next to my 3rd stitch, I'm going to take a stitch on either side. Then I'm going to skip 2, and I'm actually going to take, on the 3rd one down from there, I'm going to do this stitch and this one, and then tunnel under, and come back and do this one and this one. Tunnel under, and come down this way. And I'm doing complete stitches here. I'm not going to do a half here and a half on the other side. So I'm doing a complete stitch on the left. And then coming under here to do a complete stitch on the right. I'm going to skip 2 stitches, and on the 3rd one down, I'm going to do 2 stitches on the left. Now again, because I'm going up, I'm going to actually stitch this stitch kind of backwards. I'm going from here to here and coming up in position for the other stitch. More like the Victorian cross than the Danish. Now because I'm only traveling from the end of that stitch to this one, I'm not going to bury on this one on the back. And I'm stitching it in this way so that my traveling thread on the back is traveling the least amount of distance. So I'm going to slip this under here. Now, as the branches get longer, I'm going to definitely tunnel under on the back to bring me closer to where the next stitch begins. It's especially important to do that on this type of stitching because the color is so dark. Each new branch starts 2 spaces below the one above it. And each branch just keeps getting 1 stitch longer. And since I'm near the end of my thread now, I'm going to just go ahead and end this off before starting the next branch. One more set of branches to do, so I thought I would demonstrate another way to stitch the branches, not just this last set, but all of them. If you turn your project upside down, then you can stitch in a more traditional way. You'll still be stitching from the trunk outward to the tip of the branches. But this might be a little bit easier if you're new to linen and you don't want to think about stitching kind of upside down and backwards like I was previously. So when you're stitching in this way, you're still making your first half cross from bottom left to upper right. If I can catch it. And your second half cross from bottom right to upper left. So once again, when you're securing the traveling thread on the back, you don't have to go under every stitch. Just go under every other or every second or third stitch to work your way over to where you want to be. I'm going to roll my excess fabric up a little bit. Give you a little bit more comfortable stitching in hand. I focus so much on stitching on hand that I don't give you very many comments about stitching with a hoop. Here's what I do know about stitching with a hoop that I think is important to pass on. One is that every time you finish stitching, you should remove your work from the hoop. Do not get in the habit of leaving it. And the other tip about stitching with the hoop is don't be concerned about the hoop squishing your stitches. Of course, you're also hearing this from somebody who washes and irons all their cross-stitch pieces. So I know that when I wash it and iron it, it's going to plump back up. So the tree is made. Now I just need to add the red tips. I started with the loop method, and I'm adding one stitch at the end of each branch. And I'm starting with this one so I can work up and then work back down the other side. So at the top of the tree, now I'm going to actually turn this before I do my second half cross. So I can do this one from bottom right to upper left. And I'll just work my way all the way down this side of the tree. And that's going to conclude our lesson for today. And that's it. Now it's beginning to look festive.